16 years after losing his pregnant wife in a plane crash, a billionaire CEO on a walk through the city spots a teenage girl and immediately freezes in shock when he realizes she's a carbon copy of his late wife. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. David Crawford sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, though he saw none of it. 16 years had passed, yet the memory of Julia lingered like a ghost, refusing to fade. He had built an empire, expanded his fortune, and earned the respect of the corporate world, yet none of it mattered. Not really. The moment the news broke about the crash, his world had shattered. His wife, his future, gone in an instant, along with their unborn child. There had been no bodies recovered, just wreckage, a funeral without closure. He had tried to move forward, but something had always held him back. Maybe it was the way people whispered about him, about how a man of his power and influence still lived alone in that penthouse, how he never remarried, never even entertained the idea of dating. There were rumors, of course. People speculated whether he had been too heartbroken or too selfish to love again. But the truth was simpler. He had already given his heart away, and the woman who held it was gone. That evening, he left the office earlier than usual, stepping onto the busy city streets. His driver had already pulled the car up to the curb, but David waved him off. He wanted to walk. Maybe it was the crisp autumn air or the way the setting sun cast long shadows over the pavement, but something in him urged him forward. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he needed to move. Then he saw her. It was a fleeting moment, a passing glimpse between the crowd, but his feet froze mid-step. The girl, she couldn't have been older than 16, stood at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the light to change. David's breath caught in his throat, his heart slamming against his ribs. It wasn't possible. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear the illusion, but she was still there. The same delicate features, the same deep brown eyes, the same high cheekbones and full lips that he had traced with his fingertips 1,000 times. Julia. No. It couldn't be. The girl turned her head slightly, and the illusion broke. There were differences, subtle but real. Her hair was darker, her frame leaner, her expression harder than Julia's had ever been. But the resemblance was undeniable. David was still staring when the light changed, and the girl crossed the street, disappearing into the crowd. His feet remained planted on the pavement, his mind racing. It was ridiculous, a trick of the mind, brought on by too many years of loneliness and grief. He was just seeing what he wanted to see. Shaking his head, he forced himself to move, but the image of the girl refused to fade. Days passed, and David told himself to forget. He buried himself in work, avoiding the memories that tried to claw their way to the surface. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Then, one evening, as he walked past a row of small vendors selling everything from cheap electronics to street food, he saw her again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The girl stood a few feet away, locked in a heated argument with an older man behind a cart stacked with fruit. Her fists were clenched at her sides, her expression defiant as the vendor gestured wildly, his voice rising above the murmur of the street. "I saw you take it," the man was saying. "Don't lie to me, kid. I didn't steal anything." The girl snapped back. "I was just looking." David didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, stepping between them with the same confidence he carried into every boardroom. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was even, but the weight behind it made the vendor hesitate. The man eyed him, then the expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored suit. "She was trying to steal," he muttered. David turned to the girl, whose expression had hardened even further. "Is that true?" Her jaw tightened. "No." Without breaking eye contact, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, handing them to the vendor. "Consider it paid for." The man took the money with a grumble, shoving it into his apron before turning back to his cart. David exhaled, glancing at the girl again. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. It made his stomach twist. "I didn't need your help," she said sharply, crossing her arms. Her voice, God, even her voice carried echoes of Julia. "You looked like you could use it," he replied evenly. Her eyes flashed. "Yeah? Well, you're wrong." She turned on her heel and stalked away before he could say another word, disappearing into the crowd just as quickly as she had the first time. David stood there for a long time, his heart pounding. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't grief playing tricks on his mind. The girl was real, and so was the feeling in his gut that told him there was more to this than coincidence. Julia had been 6 months pregnant when she died. They had never recovered her body. And now, here was this girl, 16 years old, looking exactly like the woman he had loved and lost. For the first time in years, David felt something stir in his chest, something sharp and unfamiliar. Hope. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, Julia's face, staring back at him through the eyes of a girl who wanted nothing to do with him. The resemblance was too precise to be coincidence. It gnawed at him, twisting something deep in his gut. He had spent 16 years mourning a life that had been stolen from him, and now, suddenly, there was this girl. This girl who shouldn't exist. He needed answers. By morning, he had already called Thomas Reed, the private investigator he had used for delicate matters in the past. Thomas didn't ask questions, at least not at first. He understood the urgency in David's voice and agreed to start immediately. The moment David gave him a description of the girl, Thomas promised he'd have something within the next few days. But David wasn't patient. The hours dragged. He buried himself in work, took every meeting he could, signed off on every document that landed on his desk, but his mind refused to cooperate. He kept replaying the encounter over and over, remembering the way the girl had glared at him with defiance, the sharp bite of her words. "I didn't need your help." She was angry, hardened. A girl who had learned to fend for herself, who didn't trust easily. And yet, despite her tough exterior, David had seen something else in her, something fleeting. A flicker of pain. The call from Thomas finally came 2 days later. David had just finished a meeting when his phone buzzed. He answered immediately, his voice tight. "Tell me you have something." Thomas exhaled sharply. "I have more than something. You'd better sit down for this." David gripped the edge of his desk, his pulse hammering. "Just tell me." "The girl's name is Ashley Moores. 16 years old. She's been in and out of foster homes for most of her life. Her records show she was adopted as a baby, but that adoption was terminated when she was around 8. Since then, she's been in the system." Thomas paused, as if hesitating to continue. "She was found alone in a hospital as an infant. The notes in the file say she was a survivor from a plane crash. A Jane Doe." David's breath left him in a rush. He pressed a hand to his temple, barely able to process the words. "A plane crash," he repeated numbly. "Yeah. And here's where it gets interesting. The woman they believed to be her mother was severely injured when they brought her in. No identification, no personal belongings. She died at the hospital before they could figure out who she was, but it looks like they managed to save the baby. The baby, the girl, was put into the system because there were no known relatives." Thomas hesitated. "David, the timing matches. The location matches. You know what that means." David sat down heavily, his mind spinning. His wife had survived. Even if only for a few hours, Julia had been alive. And their child, the baby he had believed had died with her, had lived. Ashley was his daughter. He closed his eyes, his fingers tightening into a fist. 16 years. 16 years of her growing up alone, bouncing from home to home, while he had lived in his high-rise penthouse, convinced he had lost everything. How had this happened? How had no one told him? Had no one thought to investigate? "You okay?" Thomas's voice was softer now, less businesslike. David exhaled shakily. "No," he admitted. "I figured. Listen, I can dig deeper, find out more about where she's been, who she's been with, No. David cut him off. I don't need more paperwork. I need to see her. That might be harder than you think, Thomas warned. She's been on her own for a while. She doesn't have a stable home, doesn't seem to trust anyone. If you just show up, you might scare her off. David knew that was true, but patience had never been his strong suit. He couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He had already lost 16 years with her. He wasn't about to lose another day. That evening, he drove himself to the part of town where Thomas had tracked Ashley down. It was a neighborhood far from his own world, rundown apartment buildings, graffiti-covered walls, streets littered with broken glass and faded posters for missing persons. He hated the thought of her growing up here, struggling to survive in a world that had never given her a fair chance. She should have had everything. She should have been safe. Loved. Instead, she had been abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect her. He spotted her sitting on the steps of a small convenience store, a worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder. She was chewing on the end of a pen, flipping through a battered notebook, her brows furrowed in concentration. The sight made something ache inside him. He stepped forward, his pulse quickening. Ashley. She looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. Recognition flashed across her face, followed quickly by suspicion. You again? David forced a breath. Can we talk? She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. You don't give up, do you? He wasn't sure what to say, so he settled on the truth. No. Not when it matters. She studied him for a moment, her fingers tightening around the pen in her hand. Fine. Talk. David hesitated. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head, but now, standing in front of her, nothing felt right. How did you tell someone their entire life had been a mistake? That the father they had never known had been out there all along, completely unaware? I know who you are, he said carefully. I know where you come from. Ashley scoffed. Right. And you think I care? You should, David said, his voice firm. Because I think you deserve to know the truth. Something in his tone made her shift uneasily. What truth? He exhaled, his chest tightening. You're not who you think you are. Your mother, he swallowed. Her name was Julia Crawford. And she wasn't just some unknown woman in a hospital. She was my wife. Ashley's face went blank. Then a slow, bitter smile crept across her lips. That's cute. So what, you're saying you're my long-lost daddy? You think I'm gonna jump into your arms and cry about all the time we lost? David flinched at her sarcasm, but he didn't waver. I don't expect anything from you, he said quietly. I just need you to know that I didn't know. I thought you were gone. If I had known you were alive, I would have. He stopped, because the truth was too painful to say aloud. Ashley's expression hardened. Well, you didn't know. And I don't need you now. So do me a favor and stay the hell away from me. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder as she walked away without looking back. David stood there, frozen, as she disappeared into the night. His daughter was alive. And she hated him. David had never been one to dwell on failure, but as he drove home that night, Ashley's words echoed in his head like a haunting refrain. I don't need you. Stay the hell away from me. He had expected resistance, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer force of her anger. It wasn't just that she didn't believe him, it was that she didn't want to. She had spent too many years learning to live without him, and now he was nothing more than an intruder in a life she had built on her own. But David had never been one to walk away from a fight, especially not one that mattered. The next morning, he made a call to Thomas, asking for a new address. He already knew where she had been found as a baby, where she had bounced around the system, but now he needed to know where she actually lived. He needed to find her before she slipped away for good. She's in a foster home, Thomas told him, his voice hesitant. Not a great one. She's been there for about a year. Before that, she was moved around a lot. Never stayed anywhere too long. David clenched his jaw, hating how much sense that made. Of course, she had never stayed anywhere long. A kid like Ashley, sharp, angry, self-reliant, wasn't the kind of girl people took in easily. She had learned to survive on her own, which meant she had learned not to trust anyone. Thomas gave him the address, and David didn't waste another second. The house was small and in desperate need of repair, with peeling paint and a rusted fence that barely stood upright. It was nothing like the home he had imagined for his child. He had once dreamed of a nursery filled with warmth and love, of Julia rocking their baby to sleep, of bedtime stories and a childhood free of worry. But instead, Ashley had been raised in a world that had failed her, abandoned her. He knocked on the door, preparing for a confrontation, but the woman who answered barely seemed to care that a billionaire was standing on her porch. "Ashley Moores?" David asked, his voice level. The woman sighed. "She's in her room. Not sure she'll want to see you, though. She doesn't take well to visitors." David nodded, stepping inside. The house was cluttered, lived in, but cold. It wasn't a home. He made his way down the narrow hall and stopped in front of the last door. For a moment, he hesitated, then knocked twice. Silence. Then a muffled, "What?" "It's me," he said quietly. "David." The door swung open, and Ashley stood there, arms crossed, eyes hard. "Are you serious right now?" "I need to talk to you," David said. "Just for a minute." Ashley let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're unbelievable." She turned away from the door, leaving it open just enough for him to follow. Her room was small and sparsely decorated, the bed unmade, a pile of clothes in the corner. A few books sat stacked on the desk, worn from years of use. David's eyes flickered to a single framed photograph on the nightstand. It wasn't of a family, or of a childhood memory. It was of her, alone, standing in front of what looked like a school building. She had framed a picture of herself. He swallowed hard. "Ashley, what do you want from me?" she asked, arms still crossed. "You want me to say, 'Wow, thanks for finding me, Dad'? You want me to hug you and cry?" "No," David said softly. "I just want you to hear me out." She scoffed, but didn't tell him to leave. He took that as permission to continue. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, if I had known, that's the thing." She interrupted, her voice sharp. "You didn't know. You never came looking for me. I was in the system for 16 years, and you were what? Sitting in your mansion? Running your company?" Her hands balled into fists. "You had everything. And I had nothing."